Tonight we explore the life of Abraham Lincoln, the humble rails splitter who became America's 16th president and reshaped a broken nation. From a log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness to the echoes of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's story is one of tragedy, triumph, and a relentless pursuit of unity. So, before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy this kind of calm, reflective storytelling. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes these stories are so engaging, we forget they're meant to help us unwind. Now, it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some quiet background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight together. It all began in the quiet hills of Kentucky. On February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin near the small town of Hodgenville, a child was born into poverty. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He would grow up to lead a nation, but that future felt impossibly far away as he took his first breaths on the cold dirt floor of a frontier home. His family was poor, so poor that even candles were a luxury. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a wandering carpenter and farmer, a stern man who worked with his hands and believed in hard labor. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle, warm, and deeply spiritual. From her, Abraham inherited a sense of quiet reflection that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Lincolns moved often, chasing land and opportunity, first in Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. The land was rough, life was harder. They cleared fields by hand, planted crops, built fences, and tried to survive each winter with just enough to eat. And then, when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother fell ill with milk sickness, a deadly disease caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. She died quickly, and the loss shook the family to its core. For Abraham, it left an invisible wound that never quite healed. He would carry that grief quietly, folding it into the melancholy that shaped his personality. But light returned to the Lincoln home when his father remarried a kind widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She brought warmth and structure to the family, and she brought books. She saw something in young Abe, something thoughtful and curious. While Thomas Lincoln wanted his son to swing an axe, Sarah encouraged him to open a book. And he did, again and again. The boy from the log cabin had no fancy tutors, no fine clothes, and barely any schooling, but he had a burning hunger to learn. In a world that expected him to plow fields and remain forgotten, Abraham Lincoln quietly began to grow, not in size alone, but in spirit. It was a humble beginning, but even the tallest trees come from the smallest seeds, and Lincoln was just beginning to rise. Abraham Lincoln grew up surrounded by silence, deep forests, long winters, and the slow rhythm of frontier life. But inside that silence, something stirred. While other boys swung axes and hunted game, Abraham was often found beneath a tree, a book open in his lap, lost in a world far from the wilderness. Formal education was almost non-existent in the backwoods of Indiana. In total, Lincoln may have had less than a year of traditional schooling, but he didn't let that stop him. He would borrow any book he could get his hands on, sometimes walking miles just to read a few precious pages. The Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and later Shakespeare all became his silent teachers. His stepmother Sarah noticed this. She once said that Abraham read all the books he could lay his hands on and would repeat them word for word. She saw something in him that others missed, an almost sacred hunger to understand the world, to make sense of things most boys never even questioned. But life wasn't easy for a boy who read instead of fought. His father Thomas didn't fully understand Abraham's obsession with books. He valued hard work, not hard thinking. And while Abraham did his chores, splitting rails, hauling water, tending animals, his mind often wandered elsewhere. He dreamed of distant places, of ancient heroes, of justice, honor, and freedom. People noticed how strange he was. He was tall, awkward, and incredibly strong, yet quiet, almost shy. And when he did speak, his words carried a weight beyond his years. His neighbors were baffled by this lanky youth who could quote entire passages of poetry, then out-wrestled the strongest man in the county. But underneath his calm voice and polite manner was a restless energy. Lincoln wasn't satisfied with the life he'd been born into. The log cabin had taught him how to survive, but the books taught him how to think, and more importantly, how to dream. He once wrote, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who will get me a book I ain't read." It was in those pages, lit by candlelight, that Abraham Lincoln first began shaping the mind and the heart that would one day guide a nation through its darkest storm. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached his early 20s, he was tall, remarkably tall, standing at 6'4". He wore clothes that rarely fit, his pants always a little too short, his sleeves a little too loose. His face was lean and weathered, and his voice carried a slow, thoughtful rhythm. He looked like a man carved from the very trees he once split. In 1831, Lincoln arrived in the small frontier town of New Salem, Illinois. He had no money, no formal training, and no clear plan. But he had something more powerful than a resume. People liked him, almost instantly. He took a job as a store clerk, and though the store wasn't always busy, Abe made an impression. He was known for being honest to a fault. If someone overpaid by a few cents, he would walk miles just to return the change. If he borrowed a book or tool, he always brought it back, sometimes in better condition than when he received it. His honesty earned him a nickname, Honest Abe. But it wasn't just his integrity that won people over. It was his wit. He told stories, long, meandering, hilarious stories. Stories that made people forget their troubles and lean in a little closer. He had a gift for language and timing, a way of turning even a simple anecdote into something unforgettable. He wasn't polished, he wasn't educated, but in New Salem, Lincoln began building something important: trust. People came to him for advice, for laughter, and eventually for leadership. In 1832, he ran for the state legislature. He lost, but he didn't disappear. 2 years later, he tried again, and this time he won. In between, he served briefly in the Black Hawk War, not as a fighter, but as a captain. He never saw combat, but he was elected by the men, another sign that people believed in him.
Lincoln's time in New Salem was short, but it was foundational. It was there that he tasted the beginnings of public life. There, that quiet boy who read by firelight became a man people listened to. He wasn't just telling stories anymore. He was beginning to write one of his own. After his time in New Salem, Abraham Lincoln set his sights on something bigger: the law. He had no formal degree, no classroom, no teacher. Instead, he studied alone, borrowing law books and reading them late into the night, just as he had done with poetry and scripture in his boyhood. By 1836, he passed the Illinois bar exam and became a licensed attorney. Springfield, Illinois, became his new home, a growing town full of energy, politics, and ambition. There, Lincoln joined a law firm and began taking on all kinds of cases: property disputes, debts, assaults, even murder trials. He quickly earned a reputation as a skilled, fair, and ethical lawyer. He spoke plainly in court, used humor when needed, and never humiliated his opponents, even when he outsmarted them. But Springfield didn't just shape Lincoln's career, it also changed his heart. It was there that he met Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Mary was unlike anyone Lincoln had ever known. She was sharp, confident, and shared his interest in politics. Their courtship was complicated. They were engaged, then separated, then reconciled again. Some of Lincoln's friends said he wasn't sure if he was good enough for her. Others believed he feared he couldn't give her the life she deserved. Still, on November 4th, 1842, they married. Their union was passionate and stormy. Mary had a fiery temper and suffered from emotional instability. Lincoln, calm but often distant, struggled with melancholy. They loved each other deeply, but lived through many difficult seasons together. They had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. The heartbreak would touch the family again. Edward died at just 4 years old. Willie, perhaps Lincoln's favorite, died of illness in the White House at age 11. Only Robert would live into adulthood. Behind the courtroom victories and rising public career, Lincoln carried a deep private sorrow. He was often quiet, spending long hours alone. Friends described his sadness as something that never left him, like a shadow following just behind. But through it all, he kept going. He had begun to see that the law was more than just rules and arguments. It was about people, about fairness, about right and wrong. And somewhere deep inside, Lincoln was already imagining a country that could be more just than the one he had inherited. By the mid-1850s, America was cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. It called itself the land of liberty, yet millions were still enslaved. The debate over slavery was no longer just a matter of politics, it was becoming a national identity crisis. And Abraham Lincoln, once a one-term congressman, found himself drawn back into the storm. At first, Lincoln hadn't spoken out forcefully. He disliked slavery, calling it morally wrong, but he didn't see himself as a radical. What he did believe with clarity and conviction was that slavery must not expand. That's what brought him back into the public eye. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. To Lincoln, this wasn't just bad policy, it was a betrayal of the founding ideals. He began speaking again, slowly at first, then with increasing power and purpose. And then came 1858, the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas was a seasoned senator, charismatic and confident. Lincoln, the challenger, looked plain by comparison. But when they met in 7 open-air debates across Illinois, Lincoln surprised everyone. He didn't shout, he didn't insult. He reasoned calmly, persistently, forcefully. He asked, "Can a nation remain half slave and half free?" And he didn't believe it could. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, his words traveled far beyond Illinois. Newspapers across the country published his arguments. People started talking about this tall, awkward lawyer from the Midwest who spoke with honesty and moral clarity. By 1860, he was being considered for the highest office in the land. The Republican Party saw in Lincoln something rare, a man who opposed slavery without hatred, who spoke firmly but not cruelly. He wasn't the favorite, but in a divided field, he emerged as the nominee. And then, on a cold November night in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. The South didn't wait for him to take office. Within weeks, states began to secede. The Union, the very idea of the United States, was crumbling.
Lincoln hadn't yet stepped into the White House, but he was already walking into history. When Abraham Lincoln took office in March of 1861, he stepped into a nation already at the edge of collapse. 7 southern states had seceded before he even placed his hand on the Bible. More would follow. They believed his presidency threatened their way of life, especially the institution of slavery. Lincoln didn't want war, he wanted unity. But when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April, the choice was made for him. The Civil War had begun. He had never led an army, never commanded troops, never studied war. Yet now the fate of a nation rested on his shoulders. He read military books at night, consulted generals by day, and made difficult decisions, often alone and often with heavy doubts. The war dragged on, and it was brutal. Battle after battle, the death toll rose. Young boys both north and south marched into muddy fields and never returned. Cities were burned, families were torn apart, brothers fought brothers. It was no longer a political disagreement. It was a human tragedy. Lincoln faced pressure from all sides. Newspapers mocked him. Political enemies accused him of tyranny. Even members of his own cabinet questioned his leadership. He fired general after general, searching for someone who could match the urgency of the hour. And at home, he grieved. In 1862, his beloved son Willie died from typhoid fever inside the White House. Lincoln, already prone to sadness, was devastated. He shut himself away, sometimes visiting Willie's grave late at night, but still, he kept going. In the middle of this chaos, he made one of the boldest moves in American history. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were now free. It didn't end slavery overnight, but it changed the war. It turned the fight into a moral battle, not just to save the Union, but to redefine it. Lincoln once said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And with that document, he put the full weight of the presidency behind that belief. He didn't just want to win a war, he wanted to win the soul of a country. As the war dragged on, Abraham Lincoln understood something deeply, that battles might decide the outcome of a war, but words could shape the soul of a nation. He had always been a man of careful speech, choosing each phrase with patience. But in 1863, standing on a battlefield soaked with blood, he would give a speech that would live forever. The Battle of Gettysburg had been one of the deadliest of the war. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The town was left scarred, the fields turned into graveyards. In November, months after the battle ended, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. He wasn't the main speaker. That role belonged to a well-known orator who spoke for over 2 hours. Then Lincoln stood up. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and began to speak. His voice was quiet, and the speech lasted barely 2 minutes, just 272 words. No grand gestures, no dramatic flourishes, just clarity, purpose, and poetry. 77 years ago, he began, reaching back to the founding of the nation. He reminded the crowd and the country that this war was not only about preserving the Union, it was about proving that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a promise, a reminder, a challenge. At first, many were silent. Some didn't know what to make of such a short speech. But over time, those words became something more. They were repeated in classrooms, engraved on monuments, and memorized by generations. In a time of chaos, Lincoln offered simplicity. In a time of hatred, he offered dignity. He didn't speak to crush his enemies.
He spoke to lift the living, to give meaning to the fallen. The Gettysburg Address wasn't just a speech, it was a turning point, not of the war, but of national identity. Lincoln redefined what it meant to be American, not just united by borders, but united by ideals. He believed words could heal, and with 272 of them, he helped a grieving nation begin to remember what it stood for. By the beginning of 1865, the end of the war was finally in sight. After 4 long, bloody years, the Union armies were closing in on the Confederacy. Cities had fallen, supply lines were collapsing, and with every passing week, the South's resistance began to crumble. But Abraham Lincoln didn't celebrate. He was tired, not just in body, but in soul. The war had aged him. His face was lined, his eyes heavier, his once dark hair now almost entirely gray. Friends and reporters noted how thin he'd become. The burdens of war, death, and national division had carved their weight into his frame. And yet his focus never shifted. Even as victory approached, he thought not about punishment, but about healing. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not with triumph, but with grace. He didn't gloat. Instead, he offered words of reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, urging the nation to bind up its wounds and care for those who had suffered on both sides. It was one of his most beautiful speeches, calm, humble, and deeply human. Then, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert L. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been saved, and slavery, the institution that had divided the country for centuries, was finally ending. Across the North, bells rang and crowds cheered. There was a sense of relief, of cautious hope. People imagined a future of rebuilding, of reunion. Lincoln began making plans not just to restore the South, but to reimagine what America could become. He would never get the chance. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. As he sat in his theater box, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped in and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15th, with his wife Mary by his side, and the nation in mourning. He had lived to see the war end, but not the peace that followed. When Abraham Lincoln died, the country didn't just lose a president, it lost its compass. News of his death spread like a cold wind across the nation. In the North, people wept openly in the streets. Church bells rang for hours, businesses closed, entire cities went silent. Even those who had once criticized him now spoke of his greatness with reverence. His body was placed in a grand funeral train that journeyed from Washington, D.C. all the way back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the route, thousands lined the tracks, standing in silence as the train passed. Men removed their hats, women held their children close. It wasn't just mourning, it was a farewell to the man who had held them together during the country's darkest hour. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, near the town where he had once walked as a young lawyer. The grave would soon be marked by a towering monument, and later still, his face would be etched in stone at Mount Rushmore and printed on currency. But behind all the marble and myths was a man, a real man, one who battled depression, one who knew grief intimately, one who never believed himself to be extraordinary. And yet, he changed everything. Lincoln didn't live to see the full impact of his work. He never saw the Reconstruction struggles or the long civil rights movement that would come more than a century later. But the seeds he planted, in speeches, in laws, in moral clarity, continued to grow. He reminded America what it should strive to be, not perfect,
but better, not divided, but united, not driven by hate or fear, but by compassion, reason, and courage. Today we remember Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the man who led with both strength and gentleness. But perhaps what makes him truly great is not just what he did, it's who he was. A boy who read by candlelight, a lawyer who spoke with honesty, a leader who never lost sight of humanity. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't require perfection, only purpose, integrity, and a heart that refuses to turn away from what is right. And in that way, Abraham Lincoln still lives in the ideals he helped shape, and in the quiet strength he left behind. To many, the word Viking conjures images of wild warriors with axes and horned helmets, storming villages and burning everything in sight. But the truth, as it often is with history, is more complicated and far more interesting. The Vikings weren't a single people or empire. They were Norsemen, seafaring tribes from modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, living between the late 8th and early 11th centuries. To themselves, they weren't even Vikings. The term Viking was more of a verb than a name. To go Viking meant to go on an expedition, sometimes to trade, sometimes to raid. They were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, storytellers. They raised goats and wheat, they built wooden halls, they worshipped gods like Odin and Thor, and believed that their fate was woven by unseen hands, the Norns, who watched over every soul. Most Viking men weren't warriors. They were workers, strong, skilled, and deeply connected to the land. But when the harvests failed, when the fjords froze, when opportunity called across the sea, many took up their shields and swords. They weren't driven by bloodlust. They were driven by survival and ambition. Their world was one of harsh winters, short summers, and a constant struggle against nature. But they were adaptable, fiercely so, and their curiosity was endless.
They sailed across waters others feared. They explored unknown lands. They mingled with cultures far beyond their own. Some became merchants, sailing down the rivers of Eastern Europe to trade in silk and spices with the Byzantines. Others founded settlements in places as far as Ireland, France, and even Russia. To those they attacked, they were seen as barbarians, destroyers of peace. But to themselves, they were bold adventurers, carving out a future in a world that often gave them little. It's easy to paint them with one brush, to imagine them as only raiders. But their true story is more layered, more human. Before we follow them across seas into battles and legends, we must first remember the Vikings were not monsters. They were men, and they were about to change the world. If the Vikings had one unmatched advantage, it was their ships. Long, narrow, and elegant in design, the Viking longship was not just a mode of transport. It was a symbol of freedom, fear, and possibility. Carved from oak and assembled with precision, these vessels were both strong and flexible. The wood planks overlapped like fish scales, held together with iron rivets and sealed with animal hair and tar to keep out the cold, salty sea. Their design allowed the hulls to flex with the waves instead of fighting them, giving the longships incredible stability in rough water. Each one was a marvel of engineering. The average longship could carry 40 to 60 warriors, along with supplies, tools, and weapons. But what made them so feared and so effective wasn't just their size or speed. It was their adaptability. Viking ships could travel across the open ocean and then glide silently up narrow rivers. They could sail in just a meter of water, meaning they could strike deep inland where no one expected them. And they didn't need harbors or docks to land, just a stretch of beach, a shallow bank, or even a rocky shore. In the time it took villagers to spot them, the Vikings were already ashore. At the front of many ships was a carved figurehead. often a dragon or serpent, designed to frighten both enemies and evil spirits. As the ships approached, the sea seemed to churn beneath their prows, their sails full of wind, their crews silent but ready. The sight of a longship on the horizon became the stuff of nightmares across Europe. It meant trouble was coming, fast, unexpected, and ruthless. But not all longships were used for war. Some were merchant vessels, wider and deeper to carry goods. Others were for exploration, sailing west to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The longship was more than a machine. It was freedom, a way to escape poverty, seek glory, or find a new home. With their ships, the Vikings weren't bound by borders. The ocean was their road, and every horizon was an invitation. The world first truly noticed the Vikings on a quiet summer day in the year 793. It began on the holy island of Lindisfarne, just off the northeastern coast of England. For years, monks had lived there in peace, copying manuscripts, praying, tending their flocks. It was a sacred place, a place of silence, learning, and devotion. Then came the ships, long, slender, and unfamiliar. They sliced through the sea with terrifying grace. No warning, no negotiations, no chance to prepare. The Vikings came ashore swiftly. Their axes flashed, their shields clashed, and in moments the monastery, once a place of sanctuary, became a scene of chaos. The monks were unarmed. They had no soldiers, no walls, no idea what was coming. Some were killed, others taken as slaves. The church was plundered. Gold, silver, and holy relics were carried away. It was not just a robbery. It was a shock. The people of Christian Europe believed their holy sites were protected by divine power. But here were these strange men from the north, gods of thunder on their lips, not Christ. News of the raid spread quickly. It was written in fear and disbelief. The wrath of the Northmen, one chronicler wrote, is upon us. To the English, the Vikings seemed like demons, merciless, bloodthirsty, and godless. But to themselves, it was something else entirely. They saw wealth, unguarded and plentiful, and they took it. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the next few decades, Viking raids became more frequent, not just in England, but across Ireland, Scotland, and the coasts of France. They struck monasteries, ports, and villages always quickly, often before anyone could react. They didn't come to destroy for destruction's sake. They came for silver, spices, livestock, and slaves. To survive, to gain, and yes, sometimes to prove their courage. To a Viking warrior, a successful raid meant honor, a share of treasure, a name that would be sung around fire-lit halls. But these early raids sparked something bigger. They changed how the world saw the North, and they marked the beginning of an age when no coast was ever truly safe again. Though history often remembers Vikings as brutal raiders, that's only one part of the story. Not long after the first waves of raids swept across the coasts of Europe, something curious happened. The Vikings didn't always leave. They stayed. They built. They became settlers. In Ireland, towns like Dublin and Wexford began as Viking outposts, simple camps where raiders could rest, repair their ships, and prepare for the next strike. But over time, these camps grew. Markets appeared, homes were built, families formed. The raiders had become residents. It happened again and again. In northern England, the Vikings carved out a territory called the Danelaw, land under Norse control where Viking law was enforced instead of English rule. In Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands became Norse strongholds. Even in modern-day Russia, Vikings, known there as the Rus, navigated the rivers and began ruling over Slavic towns, founding trade centers that would one day become cities like Kiev. But one of the most important shifts happened in France. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo struck a deal with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. Rollo had been raiding northern France for years, his fleet attacking along the River Seine. But instead of continuing the endless violence, Charles offered land in exchange for peace. Rollo accepted, and the region became known as Normandy, the land of the Norsemen. There, Norse culture slowly blended with Frankish tradition. Vikings became Christian. They adopted local customs, language, and farming techniques. Within a few generations, their descendants would be fully French, and yet still carry the legacy of their Viking roots. This pattern repeated across the Viking world. The same hands that once swung axes began tilling fields. The same ships that carried warriors now transported grain, cloth, and tools. The sword gave way to the plow. Viking settlers intermarried with local populations. They learned new languages. They brought their gods and sometimes left them behind. They didn't just invade, they transformed. The image of the wild, lawless Viking hides a deeper truth. They weren't just destroyers of kingdoms, they were founders of them. To understand the Vikings, you must understand what they believed. Because behind every raid, every voyage, every final breath on the battlefield was a belief in something greater, something eternal. The Norse world was filled with gods, giants, spirits, and fate.